So today the subject will be discrimination, Medtronic ICDs. Up my screen first. Up. So you know probably this manuscript. This one has been written, and it's advices for programming the ICD. And there are specific guidelines company by company. So here we are at Medtronic, and the subject today will be the discrimination. So you see here the discriminators, what is recommended for a single chamber. We will see that in a single lead ICD, you have the choice between three discriminators: the wavelet, the stability, and the onset. And you see that what is recommended is to program just the wavelets, only the analysis of the morphology. Okay, and we will see that you can program it even inside the VF zones, and then there is a SVT limit at 230 beats per minute. What it means is that you can ask for a discrimination of the arrhythmia up to a rate of 230 beats per minute. For the dual chamber ICD and the CRTs, the same. You have the choice between the PR logic and the wavelets, and what is recommended, and to program them both. And I will explain how it will work specifically in dual chamber ICD. And the other parameters should be programmed off, the stability and the onset. Okay. So the main message is that in the single lead ICD, you will program the wavelet only up to a limit of 230 beats per minute. Of course, you need to adapt to the characteristics of the patient. And of course, if the patient, for example, is in complete AV block, there is no point to program the discrimination, of course. But if not, in general, you should probably program the discrimination up to a limit of 230 beats per minute. And for the dual chamber pacemaker, both the PR logic and the wavelets. So the point today is to explain. I'm going to show you two tracing of single lead ICD, but I will mainly focus on the dual chamber discrimination and try to explain how will work the PR logic and the wavelets, and in which situation you will have an interaction between the PR logic and the wavelets. Okay, so now you can share your screen, the programmer. Okay, so this is a quite old ICD. It's a Virtuoso VR, so a single lead ICD. And anytime I'm showing these cases, I'm a bit surprised about the programming. You see here, there was a VT zone starting at 100 beats per minute. That it was a programming that was quite frequent 15 years ago, but that we do not program anymore in any patient. But that's not the topic today. The point here is to discuss about the discrimination. So you see on the plots initially a normal rhythm, and then a sudden acceleration with a rhythm pretty low, and then an ATP is delivered, a burst, and then a reduction probably of the. If you click on the EGM. So on the EGM, you see here, you have access to all the tracing before the arrhythmia and during the arrhythmia. That's not the case in many cases in Medtronic ICDs, and that can be a difficulty when you want to analyze the morphology, for example, before the tachycardia and during the tachycardia. Okay, so there is a sudden onset of tachycardia, clearly, then the tachycardia is pretty stable. And if you analyze visually the morphology of the signals, they are completely different in sinus rhythm and during the tachycardia. So all three discriminators are in favor of ventricular tachycardia. If you click on the text, you will see, if you go down, you see here the morphology. You see here, I will give you some details. First of all, there is a first discriminators, which is the sudden onset. You will compare 4 consecutive cycles to the next 4 consecutive cycles. And if there is a sudden onset, an abrupt change on the rate, it will be in favor of ventricular tachycardia, so the nominal value will be 81%, whatever. But the second parameter that you will study is the stability. The stability will study the interval and compares to the previous 3 ones, and you will ask for a difference. If the arrhythmia is stable, it will be in favor of atrial fibrillation. Okay, and the third one is the morphologue. You will analyze the last 8 cycles. You see here the numbers. You see the last 8 cycles before the diagnosis, before your counters are full. And then you will ask if 3 of them are considered similar compared to the reference, then the diagnostic will be SVT. In this example, for example, the threshold program for the similarity is 70%. And you see that all 8 cycles, the percentage of is less than 70%. So none of the signals or none of the cycles are considered as a match. Therefore, it is in favor of the VT. So in this case, all 3 parameters, all 3 discriminators are in favor of VT. Okay, simple. As I said, now I will share my screen. As I said, it is not recommended today to program all 3. It's recommended to program only 1. You need to remember that in Medtronic, if you program the 3 discriminators, you need all 3. It means that if there is no sudden onset, that's the end of the analysis. It's not going to be a VT. If it is unstable, that's not going to be a VT, it's going to be SVT. And if there is a match, that's going to be SVT also. For a diagnosis of VT, you need all 3. If you program all 3, you need a sudden onset, a rhythm stable, and a difference in morphology. So let's have a look to this example here. This is also a single lead ICD. You see initially a normal rhythm and then an acceleration inside the VT zone. Once more, this programming is a bit surprising when you consider the guidelines nowadays, but okay. And you see that it is quite unstable. The rhythm is quite unstable. If you have a look to the EGM, that's what I was explaining before. Most of the time, you don't see the 3 first signals at the onset of the arrhythmia. So it's difficult, for example, to compare what you have during the tachycardia with what you have during before the tachycardia. That's a limitation for the analysis for us of the origin of the rhythm. The reason is not to increase the consumption. If you ask to see all the EGM, it will increase the consumption. But you see there is a sudden onset, clearly, an acceleration. But now this is an episode of VT. For example, if you compare during tachycardia and after tachycardia, there is clear change in the morphology. That was an example of a patient with a VT. But now if you analyze so that's a VT, but if you analyze the stability, you will see that, for example, this cycle is 480 milliseconds. This one is 420, so there is a 60 milliseconds difference between these 2 cycles. Nominally, the stability is programmed at 40 milliseconds. So if you had programmed, in this case, the stability, then the diagnosis would have been SVT at this time, and the counter of VT will have been reset to 0. So in these patients, the only thing that you had programmed, you see here, the stability was off. Arrêt means off. Démarrage brutal is sudden onset is also off. The only thing that has been programmed, the only discriminators is the morphologue. The threshold is 70%. And you see that there is a no match for all 8. What I mean when I show this example is to explain that if the morphologue is working properly, and that's a discussion that we could have, I think in the next sessions, Sylvain Ploux will show you some results that we have about the different discriminators, company by company. We were not completely convinced by the quality of the morphology in Medtronic devices, but if it works properly, like in this example, it's not better to add other discriminators, in fact. In this example, for example, if you ask for all three, then the diagnosis will be SVT because of the instability. In an arrhythmia, sometimes it's not that it is really irregular. You see it's pretty irregular here, but it's the time of the sensing of the signals. When you breathe, sometimes in some patients, the same signal in a very stable tachycardia can be detected quite early or later, and it may create problems with the criterion of stability. Okay, so that's for the single lead ICD. If there are any questions, do not hesitate. Can you switch now to the tracing? Next one. So that's that's quite an old one also, but that's an example here, and you see on the tracing the dissociation between the atrium and the ventricles. If this is real, so you have of course to check the EGM, but if this is real, this is clearly in favor of a VT. But as you see on top of the screen, it's written SVT onset. And this episode has been considered as SVT because of the lack of sudden onset. There is a progressive, according to the device, acceleration of the tachycardia, and therefore it is not treated. And you see here that what is most likely that it is clearly a VT, and we will check after with the EGM, but it's clearly a VT. But probably that there has been a sudden acceleration, but just slower than the tachycardia, and then there is acceleration of the VT, and then you reach the area, the zone of the ventricular tachycardia. So when you will compare, there is for the device no acceleration because you are just at the limit of the tachycardia zone. Okay, now if you go to the EGM, you see clearly that's a VT, but every time it will write reset onset, reset onset, reset onset, reset onset. Okay, because there is no sudden onset. So now if you click on the parameter, yes, on the parameter and the discrimination, you see that in a dual chamber ICD, that's an old one. So in the new ones, you can add, of course, the wavelets in dual chamber and triple chamber ICD. But in this one, you only have access to the PR logic and what is written as other enhancements and stability and onset. It means that in a dual chamber ICD, you can program, if you want, these two parameters of single lead discriminator. The same in the single lead, you can program in dual lead ICDs. And remember one thing is that if you program on stability and onset, then first, before analysis of the PR logic, you will have to be classified as an episode of VT. You will require first the stability and the onset. It means that in this example, if you have asked the PR logic to discriminate, you will have said clearly this is a VT because there is a faster ventricular rate than the atrial rate. But if you program other enhancements, there will not be any analysis of the PR logic if the device considers that there is no sudden onset. Okay, so what I would recommend, if the atrial lead is working properly, then you should program the PR logic and maybe the wavelet in the new ones, we will see, but you should unprogram the stability and onset, because if you program these single lead discriminators, then they will be analyzed before the PR logic, and if they are not verified, the device will consider the episode as a SVT and not a VT, even if the diagnosis is very easy, for example, for the PR logic. Okay, you can program only these parameters, stability, onset, and wavelet also. If there is a problem, for example, at the level of the atrial lead, if there is a lot of atrial undersensing or oversensing, then probably the PR logic is not the best algorithm, and then you should reprogram the device as a single lead ICD in terms of discrimination. Okay, no question? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the dual ICDs, dual chamber ICD, and that will up. So this tracing. So now, if you look at the guidelines in a dual chamber ICD or in a triple chamber ICD, what is recommended is to program the PR logic and the wavelets. You can have access to both of them. And this is what is recommended to program them both. And I will explain now how it will work. So the PR logic is considered as very difficult to explain, but I think you can explain it at the end. Maybe not give all the details on how it will work, but I think it's very easily possible to explain it. And what is important is to understand in which situation there's going to be the PR logic and the wavelets, or the PR logic only. So in all the patients I will show you, we will consider that you have programmed both the PR logic and the wavelets. Okay, so in this example here, you see a normal rhythm initially, and then an acceleration inside the VT zone. So there are some cycles outside the zone that will reset the VT counter, but at one time there is a stabilization inside the VT zone. And this episode will be considered as a VT by the PR logic, and the burst will be delivered with a reduction. So remember, the PR logic 6 parameters are analyzed. One of these parameters is the difference between the ventricular rate and the atrial rate. If the ventricular rate is considered as faster than the atrial rate, so the point here is that before your counter is full, you will analyze the last 10 cycles at the level of the ventricle, the last 10 cycles at the level of the atrial. You will define the mean atrial rate, the mean ventricular rate, and if the ventricular rate is faster than the atrial rate, V faster than A, then the diagnosis will be VT. So even in the PR logic, there is this step of the comparison between the ventricular rate and the atrial rate. If the ventricular rate is faster than the atrial rate, the diagnosis will be VT. Okay, so that's the case here in this example. The PR logic will say this is a VT. If you have programmed both the PR logic and the VT counter and the wavelets, the morphology, if the PR logic says this is a VT because the ventricular rate is faster than the atrial rate, there is no possibility of correction with the wavelet. There is no analysis of the morphology in this case. Okay, so if you have programmed both PR logic and wavelets, if they faster than A, then that's a VT, and that's the end of the analysis without analysis of the morphology. Okay. Ok. Ok. Programme celui d'après. Tu l'as pas celui-là? Okay. Okay. So it's clear for everybody? Okay. So now another example. So what do you think, Hugo Pierre? What do you think about this tracing? So that's an old one also, but it's still, you will have the possibility to explain how it will work.
So we have a very fast rhythm in the atria, and also fast rhythm in the ventricle. It looks
fast rhythm and stable at the level of the atrium, pretty stable also at the level of the ventricle.
Yeah.
Okay, so what could be your diagnosis?
Well, it could be flutter, atrial flutter.
That's a possibility. Atrial flutter, other possibility.
Could be double tachycardia.
Yes, and it could be a dual tachycardia. Okay, so now if you have a look to the tracing, you see that clearly that there seems to be an association. It's 2-to-1 tachycardia, 180 milliseconds and 360 milliseconds, pretty stable. Okay, it seems to be a conducted atrial flutter. Okay, so now I will explain the different step. There is a bit of simplification in what I will explain, but that you understand how will work the PR logic. As I said, there is a first step, comparison between ventricular rate and atrial rate. In this case, clearly, the atrial rate is faster than the ventricular rate. So the step one You cannot say that the ventricular rate is faster than the atrial rate. Okay, so you will analyze the other parameters. If the ventricular rate is faster than the atrial rate, end of the analysis. Okay, that's not the case here. Atrial rate faster than ventricular rate. The second thing that you need to know is that in the Medtronic devices, everything in the discrimination is based on the comparison between atrial rate and ventricular rate. Okay, and therefore, in Medtronic devices, they work with very short atrial blanking post-ventricular sensing. To give the capacity of real analysis of the atrial rate, you need to work with short blanking. But if you work with short blanking, there is a risk of oversensing, far-field R-wave oversensing in the atrial channel. So the first step here is to say, okay, the atrial rate is faster than the ventricular rate. But the second step is to say, are the signals at the level of the atrial channels real? Is this R-wave oversensing or not? So there is a criterion. The second criterion analyzed will be, is there oversensing at the level of the atrial channel? Explaining why there will be a false diagnosis of fast atrial rate, okay? And here you will try, the device will search for, I will not give you all the details, but sequences with long, short at the level of the atrial, okay? And you need to have one sensing at the level of the atrial, which is very close to the ventricular signals also, okay? So if there is a repetition of sequences, long, short, with one of the cycles that is detected just before or just after the ventricle, there will be a suspicion of oversensing, okay? In this case, that's not the case, okay? You don't see long, short, the atrial sensing, the intervals are really, really stable, not succession of long, short. So the second step is to say, okay, the atrial rate is faster than ventricular rate, and the signals are real. It's not a question of oversensing, okay? Then there's going to be a third. So at this time, you say, okay, what are the possibilities now? The possibility are conducted atrial fibrillation, conducted atrial flutter, or dual tachycardia, okay? Next step, is the atrial rate compatible with an episode of atrial fibrillation, okay, or atrial flutter? And then he will analyze the sequences at the level of atrium. Are there many episodes? There's going to be a counter for atrial fibrillation. I will not give you all the details, but anytime there are two atrial signals in between two ventricular ones, it means that it's probably an atrial arrhythmia, okay? And anytime you have two signals in between two, the counter of atrial fibrillation will be implemented by one. So here, all the cycles, they are 2, 4, see? So it's a 2-to-1 ratio between. So that's compatible with an atrial arrhythmia, okay? So at this time, the same. It's still possible to be atrial fibrillation, atrial flutter, dual tachycardia, okay? Then there is an analysis of the stability at the level of the ventricle. And then the criterion for the stability is completely different here that compare to the single lead discrimination. What he will analyze is 18 cycles, and he will analyze the intervals. And for example, here, all the intervals are 360, okay? And he will sum the two more frequent intervals. Let's say you have an alternance between 360, 350, 360, 350. So if you sum 360 and 350, you will have 100% of cycles in these two, okay? And this is going to be considered as stable. If more than 75% of the cycles are in these two, it's clear? Yeah. It's going to be considered as stable. Here, it's really, really stable because 100% of the cycles are 360 milliseconds. Okay, so this is considered as stable. So at this time, it will say, okay, now, if it is stable, it cannot be atrial fibrillation, conducted atrial fibrillation. Okay, clear? So there are two remaining arrhythmia possible: conducted atrial flutter, one, and dual tachycardia. And at this time, then he will analyze the association between the atrium and the ventricle. If it is a dual tachycardia, there is a dissociation between the atrium and the ventricle. So there are going to be differences in the interval between the atrium and the ventricle. You will have some rolling windows between all these two, okay? And no association between atrium and ventricle. If it is a conducted atrial flutter, then there's going to be an association, okay? So in this example, there is a clear association since the intervals are always the same. I could give you more details, but you need to understand just the global idea, okay? So at this time, the device will say, okay, there is an association. If there is an association, the diagnosis will be atrial flutter. You see here, the diagnosis here at the end is flutter atrial, okay? Atrial flutter, okay? Yeah. So remember now, so that's the case of conducted atrial flutter. If you have programmed both the PR logic and the wavelet, if the diagnosis with the PR logic is SVT, like in this case, there's not going to be any analysis of the wavelets, no correction by the wavelet for a diagnosis for SVT. Okay, so if you program it both, what is the more important is the PR logic, because that's clearly the first step before the analysis of the wavelet. And in this case, if it is a diagnosis of SVT, no analysis of the wavelet. Let's consider that that could be different in terms of morphology compared to the reference. That will not be analyzed. If the device considered with the PR logic, that's an SVT, that's the end of the analysis. So now we're going to see a patient with 3 different tracings. So this is the first one. Okay, so this time the diagnosis, as you see, is SVT atrial fibrillation. Okay, so now if you have a look to the EGM at the time of diagnosis, let's take all these steps. Okay, stop. Just before, yes. Okay, so that's the time of the diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. First step, is the ventricular rate faster than atrial rate? No. Okay, so are there signs of oversensing, meaning alternance between repetition, long, short? That's not the case here. So you will consider that's a real atrial arrhythmia. Okay, that's compatible. So the 3 options are the same: conducted atrial fibrillation, conducted atrial flutter, and then dual tachycardia. Okay, so now if the next step will be, is the tracing compatible with atrial fibrillation? Is the atrial fibrillation counter at a high value? And you see that most of the time you have at least 2, sometimes 3 atrial signals in between 2 ventricles. So the diagnostic will be, yes, that's compatible with atrial fibrillation. So the 3 possibilities are still there. The next step is the stability. So I don't see with my eyes, but the intervals. But now, if you look at the intervals, you will see that there is a change bit by bit. In fact, the last one is 270, then 260, 260, 280, 290. Okay, so if you try to find the 2 most frequent, you will have less than 50% of the cycles on these 2. So at this time, the device, it's on 18 cycles, the last 18 cycles. The device will say, okay, the rhythm is unstable. It is unstable, therefore it is conducted atrial fibrillation. End of the analysis. Okay, simple. And that's the case here. So the stability, once more, studied in the PR logic is completely different compared to the single lead ICD. It's completely different. On the single lead ICD, it's analysis on 4 cycles, 4 consecutive cycles. Here, it's on 18 cycles. Much longer analysis, okay? And then you arrive to diagnosis of atrial fibrillation. Once more, if you have programmed both the PR logic and the wavelet, no analysis of the wavelet because the diagnosis of the device is SVT, okay? Let's have a look to the next one. Okay, so now this time, when it was written on the previous one, SVT AF, it means that this is the PR logic. Okay. And now this is the same patients. And now it's SVT wavelet. Okay. So if you have a look, it's the same kind of episode, but okay. Let's have a look and to the EGM. And now go to the end at the time of the diagnosis. Okay, just a bit before. Okay, no, oops. Okay, okay. So the same step. First one, atrial rate is faster than the ventricular rate. Okay, there are some details, but I will not give you all details. So, okay, is there something like an oversensing, far field oversensing? No, there's no repetition, long, short, long, short. Okay, is this compatible with atrial fibrillation? Yes, the counter, I think, is compatible with the atrial fibrillation. Okay, so the next step now is the stability. And if you analyze the cycles, and you see now that there are many cycles that are classified that are either 280 or 290. You see, if you have a look, if you sum the cycles 280 and 290, you will have more than 50%, and you will even more than 75%. Okay, so at this time the device will say, okay, this is compatible with a stable rhythm, and therefore diagnosis can be conducted atrial flutter. This is not atrial fibrillation, in fact. And that's a wrong diagnosis, but that's the diagnosis of the device. This is not atrial fibrillation. That can be a conducted atrial flutter or a dual tachycardia. The next step is then to analyze the association between atrium and the ventricle. And you see that there are a lot of changing between the AV intervals. You see, so there is no association. So that's the case where the PR logic answer will be, this is a VT. Okay. Remember, if the diagnosis of the PR logic is VT because the ventricular rate is faster than the atrial rate, there is no analysis of the wavelet. But if the PR logic says this is a dual tachycardia with atrial arrhythmia but stable rhythm, diagnosis of VT, then that's the time where there's going to be analysis of the wavelet. Okay? And then there is a correction here, because the wavelets, if you have a look now to the text, you see that a lot of cycles are a match. You see, you have more than 3 cycles that are considered as a match. Therefore, the wavelet will correct the diagnosis and say that's a SVT. Okay, so now let's consider a patient with fast atrial fibrillations, like in this case. First of all, the counters. If you remember, last week, we were discussing about the counters. In the VT zone, every cycle out of the VT zone will reset the counter. So in many cases, you don't need even discrimination, because with the counter, the VT counter, you will not feel the VT zone, okay? But let's consider at one time there is a stabilization inside the VT zone for a quite long number of cycles. Then you will ask the PR logic. And if the PR logic in many times will say, okay, that's atrial fibrillation. But if the device say this is probably dual tachycardia, then you can have a correction with the wavelet. Okay? So many steps that may explain why at the end you will considerably decrease the rate of inappropriate therapy in case of conducted atrial fibrillation. Okay, so but let's have a look to the last tracing now. And you see, these patients had many episodes of corrected discrimination. But in this case, the patients receive inappropriate therapy. And that's one of the problems with the ICD. Remember, that's not, if the device is right 99% of the time, if it is wrong 1% of the time, that can be a problem. So in this case, okay, just burst, but you see that you were quite close in this patient to receive inappropriate shocks. Okay, 5, fibers, and maybe at one time he could have received. So that's the problem with all this algorithm. Even if you have a sensitivity or specificity of 99%, the remaining 1% can be a problem. So if you have a look now to the EGM and go to the diagnosis, that's exactly the same. Okay, at one time, you see, as I've explained, the atrial rate and ventricular rate is analyzed on the last 10 cycles, on the last 10, and that's going to be an average of the last ventricular cycles compared to the last atrial cycle. And you see that at the end here, you have quite important atrial undersensing. You see, atrial undersensing. And therefore, if there is atrial undersensing, there is a risk that you will have ventricular rate faster than the atrial rate. And that's the case here. And therefore, for the diagnosis of the PR logic, that's going to be a VT, okay, without further analysis. And remember, that's a choice. Always you have to make some choices for the manufacturers. But if the device say, okay, ventricular rate faster than the atrial rate, there is no possibility of correction with the wavelets. If you click on the text and go on the wavelets, clearly, if you had analyzed, it will have been a match. And it will have correct the diagnosis and say that's SVT. But that's not the case here. If the ventricular rate is faster than atrial rate, end of the analysis. Okay. And that's why in this patient, for example, I don't have the answer, but many pieces were correctly discriminated. But there is at least one with wrong diagnosis. And one of the possibility will be, okay, I'm going to switch off the PR logic and just base my discrimination on a single lead ICD. Okay, that's a possibility. If your atrial lead is not working properly, for sure you should unprogram the PR logic and just, if the wavelet works properly, that's not the case in all the patients, but if it works properly, then you should probably rely only on the morphology. Okay. So I don't know, the device was right 99.9% of the time, but he was wrong 0.1% of the time. But in this case, the patient received inappropriate therapy. So maybe one of the solutions will be to unprogram the PR logic and just program the wavelets and the morphology. Okay, and that's why when people say, okay, I implant dual chamber ICD just for the discrimination, see. In some patients, there is no indication for pacing, and therefore no indication for the atrial lead, except for the discrimination. Some people will say, okay, I consider that dual chamber discrimination is better than single one. I'm not so sure that's true. For example, here, what is better, the PR logic or the wavelet alone? At least if you program both, you need to understand in which specific situation there's going to be an analysis of the wavelet, because that's not going to be systematic. In only some situation when there is a diagnosis of VT and dual tachycardia, then you will have a look at the wavelets. If you want to rely only on the wavelet, then you need to unprogram the PR logic. Okay. Yeah. So it's important in Medtronic to understand in a dual chamber which are the discriminator and which are the first discriminator to be analyzed. Okay, if you program stability and sudden onset, it will be analyzed before the PR logic. If you program them off, then you will start with the PR logic. And if the PR logic say this is a VT because ventricular rate faster than atrial rate, no analysis of the morphology. Okay, so that's, I think, something very important. And in the next sessions, I think Sylvain Ploux will explain to you the specificity of the morphology in Abbott, in Boston, and in Medtronic, because I think that the results are pretty different, company by company. Okay, are there any questions? No? No questions? Okay, so next Monday, there's going to be a course, maybe on Boston devices or Abbott devices. I don't know yet, but I will next Monday be there same time. Okay, bye-bye.